All right, let's break down Kamala Dass's powerful poem, My Mother at 66. This poem absolutely nails that feeling, that universal fear of losing someone you love. So, the scene is simple and really relatable. A daughter driving her mother to the airport. And what's wild is the structure. The whole thing is one long sentence, just a rush of thoughts. She looks over at her mom in the car and sees her dozing, her mouth open. And this line hits hard. It's that sudden, painful realization of her mother's mortality. You know, it's such a painful thought that she has to look away immediately. She sees this world bursting with life, which is a stark contrast to her mother. Then, later at the airport, she looks again and sees that same paleness and decay. This brings back what she calls that old familiar ache, her childhood fear of loss. So, how does she create such a powerful feeling? Let's look at her poetic devices. First up, she uses similes. These are for making sharp, really visual comparisons. These compare her mother to death and the dim, fading light of a winter moon. Next, there's personification, which she uses to bring the outside world to life. The sprinting trees really show the energy of youth and time just speeding by. And finally, repetition. She uses this in the very last line for a massive emotional impact. That repeated smile isn't about happiness. It's all about hiding her pain and fear. Okay, so how do we use all this to actually analyze the poem effectively? It's simple. Connect the literary device to its effect and always use an example. So, her words are hopeful, but that smile is just a mask for her real fear. And the poem leaves us with this really haunting image of a daughter's hidden sorrow. It really leaves you wondering, what kind of fears can a simple smile hide? All right, let's deconstruct one of Pablo Neruda's most powerful poems, Keeping Quiet. The poem kicks off with this simple request, right? To just pause our lives together. He's really asking us to imagine it. I mean, what would that moment actually feel like? He calls it an exotic moment. Imagine all of us together with no conflict. But this quiet isn't just empty space. It's for, self-reflection and connection. In that quiet, we'd finally stop harming nature and maybe even notice how we harm ourselves. But, and this is super important, it's not about death. It's all about life. So Neruda thinks this silence can interrupt a deep sadness. But what is that sadness exactly? It's this sadness of always being busy, of never really getting who we are. And look at the earth, right? It teaches us that what seems dead is just waiting. So how does he pull this off? Well, let's get into the poet's craft. He uses a few key poetic devices. Think of them as the tools in his workshop. First up, symbolism. Basically, using one thing to represent a much deeper idea. So, the counts of 12, the earth, the fisherman, they all stand for bigger things. And understanding these tools is how we can answer those tricky questions about the poem. Okay, so how do we tackle a question like this one about the poet's sadness? It's actually a simple 3-step process. Let's break it down real quick. Step 2 is crucial. Go back to the poem itself and find your evidence. Then, for step 3, you just explain it. Connect that quote back to the poem's big idea. So in the end, he leaves the silence with us. The question is, what will you do with it?
All right, let's dive into one of the most famous and beautiful poems in English literature. This iconic opening line from John Keats, it pretty much sets up the poem's entire message.
So we're going to break down its meaning, its structure, and how you can analyze it.
It creates this lasting sense of peace and well-being that honestly never fades away.
Now, what's really interesting is how Keats contrasts this joy with life's struggles.
He actually starts by listing all the things that cause us pain and suffering. You know, things like feeling hopeless or just all the negativity that really weighs on us. But here's the key. Beauty is the thing that lifts that darkness away. Keats gives us a ton of examples, starting with the simple beauty all around us in nature. He includes everything from flowers to the inspiring stories we've all heard or read. So how does Keats pull this off? Well, let's look at his specific literary devices. Okay, one of his most powerful tools in the whole poem is the metaphor. Here, beauty is compared to this divine, life-giving source that just never runs dry. This image really helps you see that idea of beauty as a constant, nourishing force. I mean, just think of the cooling covert of streams or the green world of daffodils. And the poem's calm, steady rhythm,
That just reinforces the whole idea of peace.
All right, we get the poem's message and its craft. Now let's put it into practice.
So here's a classic question you might get. How would you even start to answer it?
A really strong answer would hit these 3 key points pulled directly from the poem.
Let's try one more. This one's asking for a very specific detail from the poem.
And the answer is that huge metaphor we just talked about. It perfectly captures the idea.
So beauty isn't just pretty stuff. For Keats, it's an essential force for living. Which leaves us with a final question for you. What's your thing of beauty?
All right, today we're breaking down a really powerful poem by Robert Frost, A Roadside Stand.
So the poem drops us right into a scene most of us have probably seen before.
And Robert Frost? He was a master at this stuff, finding deep meaning in everyday moments.
At its core, this poem is all about the painful gap between country life and city life.
Frost says the stand itself is pleading, but not for a handout. So, what's the deal?
See, they don't want charity. They just want a fair shot at earning some of that city cash.
But what happens? The fancy cars, the polished traffic, just zoom by, totally oblivious. And if they do look over, it's just a complaint about the ugly handmade signs ruining the view.
Okay, here's where things shift. Frost stops just describing and shares how he feels.
You can really feel his pain here, the weight of what he calls their childish longing in vain. And what is that longing? Just the simple, almost desperate hope that a single car will stop.
And the letdown is just brutal. The few cars that stop, they don't want to buy a thing.
So, let's talk about the poetry itself. How does Frost build this feeling of sadness?
Well, the rhymes are all over the place, and that's on purpose. It feels as unsettled as the topic.
What's so brilliant is the tone. It's brutally honest about poverty, but also full of sympathy.
All right, let's put this all together. How do you actually answer questions about this poem?
Okay, a classic question you might get is about the plea from the stand's owners. And the answer? It's literally right there in the poem. It's all about that flow of cash. So, to nail your answer, state the plea, explain why, and then back it up with a quote.
Another big one is that incredible phrase, the childish longing. What's that all about?
The poem paints this picture of them just waiting all day, almost like a prayer for a car. Basically, it's hope for a customer, and it's vain or useless because the drivers just don't care.
So what's the big takeaway? It all comes down to this massive, unfair economic imbalance.
And this leaves us with a huge question, one that's just as important today as it was then.
Okay, let's dive into Adrienne Rich's powerful poem, Aunt Jennifer's Tigers.
We're going to see how her art tells a story that her life, well, simply couldn't.
So who was the poet behind the words? Adrienne Rich was a major voice for women.
A lot of her work really digs into the pressures on women, especially in married life. This whole poem is built on a huge contrast between Aunt Jennifer and her tigers.
First up, the tigers. They are just bursting with life, totally vibrant and confident.
And get this, they're not scared of anything, pacing with this cool, sleek confidence.
But here's the twist. Look at just how different they are from Aunt Jennifer herself. You see, her hands are described as fluttering. They're nervous, weak, and lacking control. And why? It all comes down to the massive weight of her uncle's wedding band. So let's break down how the poem builds this meaning. It's all about literary devices. The biggest one here is symbolism. You really got to pay attention to one specific object. Right, that wedding band. It's not just a ring. It represents the heavy weight of her marriage. And it's a burden she can't even escape in death. That word ringed is just haunting. But her art, the tigers, they'll live on, embodying the dream of freedom she never had. Okay, so how do you take all this and build a great answer for, say, an exam? Let's try answering a classic question, why are the tigers so different from the ant? Simple. First, state the contrast. Then, use quotes as evidence. And finally, explain why.
So it all boils down to this relationship between the artist and what she creates.
Yeah, her tigers are her true legacy, a powerful glimpse of the free spirit she kept hidden.
Which leaves us with this final thought. Can art be a real escape, a true form of freedom?